IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. I am your host Apurva Kumar. For the past few years, we, the people of India, have been thinking deeply about this concept called idea of India. And it is this idea of India that seems to be under the strain of late. Much of the challenge to this idea is coming from some of our fault lines like religion and caste and other identities. A new Pew Research Center report titled Religion in India, Tolerance and Segregation talks about some of these aspects. The survey represents the opinion of the public. And to discuss this report and its findings, today we have three special guests. We have Neha Sahgal, who is Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. Welcome, Neha.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Jonathan Evans, who is a Research Associate at Pew Research Center. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we also have Mihir Mahajan, who is an adjunct fellow at Takshashila, an intellectual property rights expert. Mihir is also my co-host for this episode. Welcome, Mihir.
Thanks, Apurva. Nice to be here.
If you are interested in topics such as these and others in general, like public policy, governance, politics, and economics, then do sign up for the Graduate Certificate in Public Policy program at Takshashila Institution. The new batch is starting from 4th September, and the last date to submit your application is 28th of August. So, Mihir, why don't you start the conversation and probably then I will pitch in.
Thanks, Apurva. Neha, the first question is more for you. We all in India reviewed or read the report or parts of it with great interest. The report titled Religion in India, Tolerance and Segregation, which was released end of June, about 3 weeks ago. I just wanted to start off the conversation by asking you if you could describe the work of Pew Research in general, what countries you are in, what types of surveys or other data gathering do you do, and at what frequency?
Thanks for that question, Mihir. At the Pew Research Center, we believe that knowledge is a public good and that an informed citizenry is central to good governance as well as a functioning democracy. But that's the extent of the normative position that we take. Otherwise, we don't take any policy positions. We do not say anything is good or bad. We don't say tolerance is good or bad. We don't say segregation is good or bad. Our job is to collect data, provide it to the people free of charge, and then allow people to engage in public discourse using that data. So in a sense, we like to refer to ourselves as a fact tank to distinguish ourselves from the think tank world, which is a popular term for various policy organizations. We do survey work, but that's not all we do. We do a variety of social science, empirical research, demographic data analysis, content analysis, etc. And we do this work around the world. We're most prolific in the United States, but we have also done work on religion, for example, in Latin America, in Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe, Israel, and in predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on. India was our first stop in Asia for religion work. We have done work in India before on political and social themes, etc. But in terms of religion, this was our first stop in Asia and understanding the dynamics of religion and identity in an Asian context. We will continue on from here to Southeast Asia with similar themes as well as East Asia. You asked about frequency for the religion team, and religion is a big focus at the Pew Research Center. It's a large theme that we study. Part of why we study religion is because we feel it's important to understanding a society. In fact, understanding how a society evaluates its religious identity is really central to understanding how that society functions. So the religion work is done with the maximum frequency in the United States. We repeat surveys often, which allows us to track trends over time. Around the world, we have so far only touched every region once. We began in sub-Saharan Africa, went on to predominantly Muslim countries, then Latin America, then Europe, etc. But that's not to say we'll be back in India, not in the immediate horizon, but perhaps at some point in the future.
Thank you for that, and we certainly learned a lot from reading the results. And I think there's been a lot of debate in civil society based on the findings. There's been a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of very interesting things that I have personally learned. So really happy to be able to read the survey as it is in the public domain, and hope that wish all of you success in all the other countries, and hopefully you come back to India and do this and see changes in the picture and trends over time.
I hope so too.
Right. So let me get straight into the survey, Neha. And the survey has covered several aspects of religion, caste, nationalism, some levels of segregation along religion and caste, and levels of tolerance. For our listeners who have not read the report, could you talk about 5 major findings from the survey that explains where our society and politics are heading?
Let me start with big picture. We do find that in India, tolerance is seen as a core value. People tell us that being respectful of all religions is a very important part of Indian identity. We also find that tolerance is seen as a religious value. People tell us that respecting other religions is an important part of what being a Muslim means to them, or what being a Sikh means to them. But this sense of tolerance in India coexists with a desire for religious segregation. People tell us that they want to limit personal connections across religious lines, while also telling us that they feel that tolerance should be held high as a value. So one way in which this plays out is how people feel about, for example, interreligious marriage. They feel strongly against it. Not only that, they tell us that it is very important to stop both women and men in their community from marrying into other religions. They tend to limit their friendship circles to people in their religion. We also find that for a significant share of people, they desire living in neighborhoods that are religiously segregated as well. So we find this unique Indian understanding of pluralism, which perhaps resembles more of a patchwork quilt or maybe a thali more than it resembles maybe a melting pot or a salad bowl. And we can continue on with these kinds of metaphors of different kinds of pluralism. So that's sort of the big picture of what we see going on with multiculturalism or pluralism in India. We also find that religious segregation in India, even though it coexists with a commitment to tolerance, segregation is also tied up with some of the fault lines we see in Indian society today when it comes to debates about national identity as well as about politics. So one way we can look at this is how people see, or to what extent people see a connection between religion and national identity. It's pretty clear that for a majority of Indian Hindus, it is very important to be a Hindu to be truly Indian. And Hindus who tend to hold this type of evaluation of national identity, or Hindus who see a close connection between religion and Indian identity, tend to live more religiously segregated lives. They tend to be more likely than other Hindus to say all their friends are Hindu. They tend to be more supportive of living in religiously segregated neighborhoods. And the sentiment that the interreligious marriage of Hindu men and women should be stopped is more widespread among this group. So that's where you see that segregation in India does tie into political debates, and including how people vote and how they see national identity. So those are some of the key themes that we've looked at in some more detail in the survey.
Right, which brings me to my next question. And while going through the survey report and findings, I couldn't stop thinking about the paradoxes that this report talks about. So while on one hand, we have some progressive trends, like Indians are value religious tolerance and freedom and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we can also see some nativistic and regressive trends as well, like you said, living segregated lives, lesser friends from different religion and caste, and stopping interreligious and intercaste marriages. From a pure data standpoint, help us make sense of this paradox here.
There's a couple ways we can think about paradoxes in people's attitudes. I mean, we do survey work around the world, and if you take a look at basically every country in the world, public opinion does show a paradox in some way or another. People regularly say that they, want to pay less tax, for example, and still want more public services, right? So, so India is not unique in that way. Public opinion does throw up paradoxes nearly everywhere. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind. But another important thing is what we perceive as a paradox from the perspective of a researcher may not be shared by people who hold these views. They may not see it as a paradox. They may see it as completely reasonable to say, it's important to be respectful of other religions, but it's also important to respect the boundaries between religion. And it's totally fine to live together yet separately. Or they may think of this as, well, good fences make good neighbors. So as a public opinion researcher, I always kind of need to get out of my own head when I'm trying to evaluate how people are answering questions or what they're trying to tell us. And so we do find, for example, in the case of India, that those who say the interreligious marriage must be stopped, overwhelming majorities of them also say that respecting other religions is very important. In fact, there's no difference. How people feel about interreligious marriage doesn't change their commitment to tolerance. So, again, that kind of points to maybe it's a paradox that I am evaluating as an analyst, whereas this is a reality in people's lives. Right? They live in a multicultural, plural society. They seem to be fine with that. They seem to see that as an important part of Indian identity, but they also seem to want to live in sort of segregated bubble and want others to remain in segregated bubbles. And this seems to be a reality in their lives. Like, no matter how much of a paradox it appears to me personally, or to any analyst personally.
Interesting. Very interesting point here. And talking about paradox, I have to ask, what kind of regional differences did the survey find on some of these trends? And how do these trends vary between what is called as Hindi heartland, which comprises of central India and some parts of North India and South India?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, basically. I mean, the difference between the north and central part of the country and the south of the country does resemble more of a gulf than a difference. You can see this difference playing out in a variety of ways. I think one is, of course, political. So how do people conceive of national identity? We do find that in the central part of the country, as well as in the north of the country, the vast majority of Hindus saying that it is very important to be Hindu, to be truly Indian. This share falls considerably when you go to the southern states, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh. There you have about half as many saying that it is important, very important to be Hindu, to be truly Indian. And then this kind of difference plays out in how people conceive of Hindi as central to their national identity. So, of course, this is not too surprising. Hindi is widely spoken in the northern and the southern part of the country, and less so in the south. It also plays out in how people vote. So you find that the ruling party, BJP, gains much of its support from the northern and central regions. And it didn't do very well in the South in the 2019 parliamentary election. And that's reflected in our data as well, with fewer Hindus in the South saying they voted for the BJP. But I think one really interesting difference is also in how Hindu identity is conceived between the North and the South. In the survey, we asked the question, can a person who eats beef, can such a person be a Hindu? And overall, 72% of Hindus said that such a person cannot be a Hindu. But the sentiment gains much more widespread resonance in the northern and central part of the country than in the south of the country. In the northern and central part of the country, you have like 80-some% saying that a person who eats beef cannot be a Hindu. But when you get into the South, that share falls considerably to roughly 50% of people saying that a person who eats beef cannot be a Hindu. So same religion even, right? And there's big difference between northern and southern Hindus in what it means to be a Hindu and what is the connection between diet and Hindu identity. And of course, that sentiment then plays out in people's political views about national identity, and so on.
Okay, so Neha, in your survey, in the survey and the report, were there any urban or rural differences? Were there differences based on education and income? Because the conventional sort of wisdom would say that with growing urbanization and modernization, some of these fault lines would sort of, would go away or would improve. Did you find some of these patterns?
We do see some differences by education, for example, or by urban-rural. Those tend to be highly correlated, education and urbanicity, or where people live in the country. But overall, we don't see a huge difference by education or by urban-rural. Indians are living religiously segregated lives in urban areas, and they are living segregated lives in rural areas, maybe slightly less segregated in urban areas, and perhaps slightly less segregated among more educated people, but not a big difference. And part of it is that perhaps the reason why we don't see huge differences in attitudes between urban and rural Indians and more educated, less well-educated Indians is because India is a religious country, and it's a religious country in a broad-based way. So, as you were saying, Apurva, in your question, conventional wisdom does sort of say that as countries modernize and industrialize, their people's attitudes toward a variety of social issues can change. And one well-known theory in the social sciences says that as people gain more economic wealth, their commitment to religion decreases. So this has been the case, for example, in Western Europe, where after the Industrial Revolution, the importance of religion declined significantly. In India, we don't so far see evidence of secularization or people losing their religion. So we see urban Indians being religious, we see rural Indians being religious, we see more and less well-educated Indians expressing high levels of commitment to their religious values. And even if we ask people, how religious were you growing up and how religious are you now, we just don't see a huge decline, right, between childhood and present day. You see some declines maybe in the South, which is more urbanized, but India is still by and large a highly religious country. It doesn't show too many signs of secularizing or people losing their religion. And I think that part feeds into the fact that we see some differences in attitudes by education as well as by urban and rural, but these are not huge gaps, right? They're just a matter of degree. It doesn't quite change the story of segregation in India.
Great. At this point, I have to take a short break, and we will continue our discussion after the break.
Hey, everybody, let me tell you a little bit about what happened on the IVM Podcast Network this week. We've had some amazing stuff, right? I don't know if you're aware of the redoing or the rebranding of the Traveling Professors show. We called it now Smarter with Sid, with Siddharth Deshmukh. This week he examines Netflix getting into e-commerce, and will this affect how Amazon's dominating the space? Also, let me give you another quick hits to join up on. So on Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by Olympic equestrian Imtiaz Anis, and Nishan Burla from the Triangle Offense podcast showed up on Thursday's Cock and Bull to talk about the NBA Finals. On Nankari, Sadaf and Archie were joined by Keshav Chaturvedi of the Tere Mere Raste podcast. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talked to Ashim Mathur from Dolby. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram to keep up with what's going on the network. And with that, let me also just finally thank our sponsors. They're what makes things possible. We'd like to thank CIET, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and Lenovo. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back. Mihir, over to you.
Thanks, Apurva. And I want to bring Jonathan into the conversation. Jonathan, I wanted to start off with some questions around the methodology and the way the questionnaire was structured, and how that adaptation is done across various geographies and across various societies that this is used for. So the first question I wanted to start off with is, there is a known phenomenon called social desirability bias, which is a type of response bias in which respondents tend to answer questions in a manner that will be viewed favorably by others. For example, over-reporting what they think is a good answer, or under-reporting what they think would be perceived inappropriate. Was this something that you considered? And if so, how does the survey account for this type of bias?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and something we are very mindful of as we design all of our surveys. And particularly, we do keep this in mind when we ask about religious topics, because a lot of times people in a lot of societies do perhaps perceive that being religious is something that is to be desired. So, for example, in the US, we see that people generally overreport their church attendance. So they're more likely to say that, I'm a weekly church attender or I'm a monthly church attender than they actually are when we measure it through other ways. Like if we ask them to keep a diary of how often they attend church, we see that they attend less often than they would answer on the survey itself. And so with a lot of these questions, we think about it as we're asking them about their attitudes. If we wanted to get an exact count, perhaps, of how many times, we would have to go about it a different way. And this, though, still gives us a very useful lens to how they see themselves and see the society they live in. So even if they maybe only attend church twice a month, but they say they attend church every week, they see themselves as a regular church attender. And this is very important to their identity. And so we are aware of this, and we do try to address this, though, because as much as possible, we would like to get the most accurate data. And so we try to structure our questionnaires in a way that puts people at ease. And to do that for this project in particular, we started work on this questionnaire several years before we went into the field. We wanted to make sure that we were asking questions in a way that people would not only understand, but feel comfortable answering in the most truthful way possible. So we conducted focus groups. We did in-depth one-on-one interviews with people. We tried to figure out how they talked about things and what they were willing to talk about. Were there any topics that were too sensitive to ask about, or you could see them become visibly uncomfortable? And we don't want that, because that will shut down their responsiveness and their willingness to tell the full truth. And so we did see, though, that as we asked about the topics that are covered in this survey, that broadly Indians who came to these focus groups and to these one-on-one interviews, they were willing to talk about these potentially sensitive topics quite openly. Even things like asking about willingness to have people as your, from another religious group as your neighbor, or would you want to stop someone else from, marrying into your family from another religious community? People were willing to talk about these things and talk about what makes someone truly Indian or disqualifies them from being a Hindu. And we even had participants or a participant come up to us afterward to say thank you for giving them the opportunity to share their opinion on these topics, because this is not something they've found an outlet to express this before. And something we did between each round of these tests was we modified the questionnaire to get it more and more in line with how people were talking about these things. We also regularly sent our questionnaires and sections of it to a panel of advisors. We had 6 academic advisors from a variety of institutions who had expertise in these topics, and wanted to make sure that from all of their research that we were also staying in line with how things are accurately on the ground. And ultimately, we then also did some testing with larger scale. We ended up running a pilot test of about 2,000 interviews across 4 states and different regions of India, to make sure that not only were all of our procedures working and the tablets that the interviewers were using, making sure they worked right, but also making sure that people were giving answers and they were comfortable, and checking in with the interviewers to make sure after the fact, like, did this feel like people were giving us, good data? And after, 2+ years of all of this work, we then felt ready that our questionnaire was at a point where we could get accurate data from people that, as much as possible, had eliminated the chances for bias. We also structure the question in a way where we can ease people into it, perhaps, where we ask some fairly benign questions, perhaps, at the beginning. Things like, how often do you follow the news? Something that probably doesn't have huge social desirability bias, but also shouldn't be something that sets them on edge and makes them nervous for what the rest of the survey is going to be about. And so, yeah, we pay very close attention to how we structure the questionnaire, both in the design phase and then also as we have interviewers talking to people.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that insight into the complex process that goes behind such a large scale and important survey. And I wanted to alert our listeners that the process that Jonathan was talking about took place over a long period of time, and the actual survey is close to 30,000 respondents and across the length and breadth of India, and really provides a fascinating overview of how people think about these. Jonathan, just to continue on that line, can you talk briefly about the settings in which the respondents provided answers? Were these private one-on-one?
Yes. So we, to make it so that people would be comfortable giving us their honest answers, we instructed the interviewers. They had about a week-long training where they got to practice and prepare to give these interviews. And one of the things we emphasized was that you need to make sure that you get people into a private setting, that you need to give them the space they need so that they can give these answers, because even though people are willing to give these answers, they need to feel comfortable. So if a neighbor is listening in, or if their entire family is in the room, that is not going to set them up to be comfortable, perhaps saying something that they perceive will be at odds with what other people in the room think or feel. So we highly encouraged them and drilled it into the interviewing teams that doing this in a private one-on-one setting was the ideal and what they needed to strive for. And even if they needed to, they could, say, okay, we can't get privacy now. Can I come back, in a few hours or tomorrow morning and conduct the interview if there was time for that? That was also an acceptable thing to make sure that people were comfortable, whether they were women or men, or if they were old or young. We wanted everyone to feel comfortable in this situation.
Wow, that's a fair bit of investment in each respondent across the 30,000. So that's fascinating to know how careful you are with this. I wanted to focus next on one of the specific questions. And for our listeners, one of the things we did is looked at some of the surveys that Pew Research does in other countries. So, for example, in countries such as the United States, UK, Germany, and France, there is a question in the questionnaire that says something like, some people say that the following things are important for being truly, for example, American, whereas others say they're not important. The questions in those countries include, for example, whether the person was born in, whether it's important to the person, whether to feel American, it's important to be born in the US, to be able to speak English, to be a Christian, and to share American customs and traditions. Jonathan, we noticed that in the Indian survey, there was a similar question, but which had some local customization. For example, the born in question was omitted, but the being able to speak English or being a Hindu was included. And then there were a lot of other categories that were added, such as respecting the army, whether it's important to stand for the national anthem, to respect elders, respect all religions, know history of India's freedom struggle, respect institutions and laws, and to support India's cricket team. So what I wanted to ask Jonathan was, one is, what is the process for customization in different countries? And what made you potentially exclude the questions about the country of birth and the customs and traditions?
Yeah, this is a question, you're right, that we've asked in several parts of the world. We, on the survey you just mentioned, we also used a form of this across Western Europe, and a slightly different form of it across when we previously surveyed in Central and Eastern Europe. And what we do when we start developing a new questionnaire is we do start with questions that we've asked in other parts of the world or within the same country, but on a similar topic, to start with questions that we're familiar with and that have worked in the past. And we hold meetings with internal people, external people to get it so that it meets our needs for a specific survey. And for this question in particular, we did ask it on the survey you mentioned. We've also asked it in Western and Central and Eastern Europe, and it was slightly different each time in the categories we asked about. And that was a function of a few things. In India, it was able to be a longer list of items because we were in a face-to-face situation. So when we do an interview with people face-to-face, we can ask more questions because they are more likely to sit with us for a longer period of time. Whereas if it's someone on the phone, after a little while, they're a little more likely to hang up, perhaps, and we obviously don't want that. So that was an added benefit of conducting the interview face-to-face. You asked specifically about being born in the U.S. versus having, in India, we talked about having Indian ancestry. In parts of Europe, we also did both. We asked about being born in the country or having family ancestry in the country. And in India, one of the considerations that we factored in on this question was the fact that there were people who would be taking the survey who had been alive during partition or whose families, had to move as a result of partition. And because of that, we didn't want people to have to worry about, if someone is currently, or if the city where someone is born is currently in Pakistan or is currently in Bangladesh, does that count as being an Indian if their family then moved during partition? And there was some concern about that. So we boiled it down to, really what we want to know is there a family background to India? And is that important to people? And we do make customizations like this regularly. For example, in Central and Eastern Europe, we included asked people, is it important to pay your taxes to be part of our country? Because that was something that was widely being discussed at the time in the region.
And I'll add to that, and I think this last point that Jonathan made is an important one. What we'll try to do is put our finger on the pulse. So what are people talking about in the country as elements of national identity? And part of how we do this is through focus groups. So we brought up this particular question in a focus group, and we took note of the kinds of things that people themselves were bringing up as central to their national identity. We've been following the news for India for quite a while on these issues and consulting with our academic board as well. So we're trying to figure out kind of where are the key issues where we can fill a data gap. So in the United States, of course, it's a huge immigration country. And whether or not immigrants can ever truly be American is a really key debate. So if we were to ask these questions in the US, we definitely need to ask about being born in the United States to be truly American. In India, Indian ancestry is talked about as being part of Indian identity. The connection between religion and national identity, you cannot get away from that. It's everywhere. It's in the news. It's what people want to talk about, even in focus groups. So we'll try to figure out what customizations do we need to make to be able to discuss a topic that is on people's mind. But how do we also do that in an ethical and sensitive way?
Thank you both for that. I think the customizations are a way of getting at the nub of the question and the issue, and I think it's a nice way that was done. I just wanted to probe further on the customization. A couple of the questions stand out. For example, the support of the India's cricket team or standing for national anthem as having been in the news, potentially controversial. There have been either incidences of violence or incidences of communal disharmony around these. And some commentators have said that, have pointed out that these questions may be perceived as loaded with meaning and maybe something that should not have been asked. And I know because this is not, you're not making a normative judgment, or you're just trying to get respondents to actually provide useful information, these questions are us getting at that. But I just want to see if you wanted to respond to that commentary.
Sure. Jonathan, did you want to take a stab, or did you want to have me take this? You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I certainly can. I think these do circle back to what Neha had said, that wanting to get our finger on the pulse about what is being discussed. And repeatedly in following the news, of course, but also in discussions with academic advisors, it was brought up that these topics about loyalty to India's cricket team or standing for the national anthem were potentially fault lines that people were drawing that defined if you were or weren't being truly Indian. And so we wanted to provide some figures to show how prevalent is this perception that these are key core values, parts of being Indian. And what we found is that Indians are much more likely to say, based on the two examples you had listed, that standing for the national anthem, nearly 90% of Indians said that this was very important to being truly Indian. But supporting India's cricket team, only about a slight majority, I think 56%, said that that was something that was crucial to being truly Indian.
I like that this particular battery of questions is designed to be analyzed in a particular way. You know, what we don't do is just singularly pick out one element from this entire battery of questions and make that the headline. So you may notice that we didn't go with a headline about Hindu nationalism, and we didn't begin the entire report by saying 64% of Hindus say it is very important to be Hindu, to be truly Indian. Because as an analyst, I just don't feel that that's honest to the data. That battery of questions is designed to be analyzed together. There are elements in that battery that get at civic elements of national identity. So, for example, respecting India's institutions and laws, or knowing the history of India's freedom struggle. And there are elements of that battery that are designed to get at more nativist elements. So, for example, being Hindu and being truly Indian, or speaking Hindi and being truly Indian. And we have to analyze these together, right? Because when we begun this discussion, we talked about paradoxes in public opinion. And if you don't kind of bring out the paradox, and if you don't bring out the fact that people do say that respecting all religions is an important part of being truly Indian, then the finding about the connection between Hindu identity and national identity is taken out of context. Right? Then it's sensationalized, it's cherry-picked, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. I mean, we are a not-profit organization. We're not looking for clicks. We're not looking for eyeballs. We do not monetize on those things. Our goal is to present the findings in the right context. So none of those particular questions would ever be, or should be, I would not recommend this to any analyst, to pick out one and just run with that. So if you're looking at how people feel about supporting the cricket team, you also want to take a look at what they feel about India's institutions and laws and the freedom struggle and so on. And you want to analyze the idea behind sort of sports and nationalism in the context of other aspects of nationalism.
All right, let's take another short break, and we will be back after 10-15 seconds. Let's take a break, guys.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome back. Mihir, over to you.
Yeah, Jonathan, just continuing again, and Neha, continuing again with the questionnaire. I noticed in the questionnaire that there is an early question, question 11, I believe, which says, just your impression in India today, is there a lot of discrimination against? And then there's a set of social groups that are mentioned, both religious as well as caste-based. And then the questionnaire at a later stage comes back to some of these in question 66, where it asks, in the last 12 months, have you personally felt discriminated against because of your religious identity or caste? I just wanted to ask first, Why the two different questions, and what were the responses like to these questions?
Thank you. I'm glad you noticed that they are two different questions because we designed them that way. We wanted to measure both how people perceive the level of discrimination against a broad number of groups, as well as their own personal experience, because it's possible that someone experienced tons of discrimination and feels that they've been personally discriminated, but that broadly in society, they don't think that people who are of other groups aren't facing that discrimination, or vice versa. They maybe perceive lots of discrimination for other communities, but they say that I personally have not felt a lot of discrimination. And so we wanted to pick up on both avenues of discrimination. And we also wanted to get a sense, when we asked about perception of how other people are being discriminated or not against, we wanted to pick up, what is the feeling they have broadly on discrimination in the country. And so when we look across this broad list of groups, we asked about not only Hindus and Muslims, but also Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains. We asked about different caste groups. Do people feel that there's lots of discrimination against them? The idea is to get a sense for, do people feel they are living in a society that has lots of discrimination? And just at the broad level, looking at just the national figures, we see that most groups, or most people, when they are asked about these other groups, that it's 20% roughly or less saying that each of these groups face a lot of discrimination. There are variances regionally and within different religious groups or different caste groups, perhaps, but at the broad level, people generally say that there is not a lot of discrimination against these other groups.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I wanted to follow up on that. Is in the second question where the survey asked respondents about whether they personally felt discriminated against. Unlike many of the other questions in the survey, where the person that's conducting the survey has options to prompt the respondents with guidance or examples. For example, if a person was not able to initiate an answer to a question such as what is your religious belief, maybe the surveyor could prompt them with names of religions or names of other kinds of groupings. So one question I had is, in this personally felt discriminated against question, I noticed that there was no real follow-up or guidance that the survey would provide. So for example, in the news, there's a lot of items often that come up about people being discriminated against when trying to rent or buy an apartment, or people being discriminated against because of their food habits, or when interacting with a private entity or with government authorities. Just wanted to ask if do you believe one why the guidance would the guidance have made a difference, and if so, what is the idea? What is the background when you provide the guidance and sometimes when you omit the guidance on the follow-up?
Yeah, well, thinking about the one example you listed about when we asked people what their religious identity is, we did provide some prompts for that one, specifically things like if someone names two religious groups, if they happen to say that they both identify as a Christian and as a Sikh, for example, there are certain questions in the questionnaire that are only directed towards certain groups, or certain groups are excluded because it wouldn't make sense to ask them a question, or we need to ask it in a certain way. And so for a question like that, where it has an impact on the survey filtering, where people end up going throughout the survey, we do need to make sure that we get people into the category where they do feel the most comfortable. So on those sorts of things, we do occasionally provide some guidance to interviewers, or we tell them things like, on that question, we also said that they shouldn't base it on appearance. They shouldn't just make an assumption that this person has this article of clothing or this thing on their wall. No, you need to ask the person what their religious identity is and let them give you the answer. But specifically on this question about discrimination, we did not include any sort of prompt or definition, you're right, because we did not want to color their perception of what we were asking about beyond the term discrimination. because while we know that in the news media, there's lots of discussion, you're right on, people claiming that they've been discriminated against about, from a job interview or when interacting with a shopkeeper or trying to rent an apartment or something. We know that those exist, but if we list just one or two, those are the types of discrimination that the person will be thinking about when we ask the question. So unless we ask a long list and ask specifically, have you faced this kind of discrimination or have you seen this kind of discrimination? If we don't go through a full list, we're just going to be painting their view and priming them just to think, say, about job discrimination. And what we really wanted with these questions was to get their sense when both asking about other people's discrimination experiences as well as their own, just is there discrimination? Because we know that that's also a term that many people will have familiarity with, and there will be a gut reaction, and they will react to what it means for them. And it's true. It can then call to mind for one person more job discrimination and to another more about renting or buying a home or an apartment. But really the goal was to get their reaction to discrimination, and do they personally, or in the case for other people, see it as happening.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jonathan. It's important for us when we read the report to keep this in mind, that the scientific nature of the design and the way the surveys are designed to not prime people's minds in certain instances, and in other places getting them to respond so that the survey can actually achieve its objectives is just absolutely fascinating. And I must congratulate your whole team for a very well designed survey that elicited a lot of responses that are going to continue to prompt discussion all among society here as well as worldwide. I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Apurva?
So Neha, for me, one of the most fascinating findings, and someone who's interested into the democratic politics and other aspects of India, so one of the most fascinating findings for me, among several others, was the ambivalent views on democracy and preference for a strong leader, something that has been often being spoken about in the past few years. Does this trend also vary as per the region and education levels across India?
Some, but not a lot. It does vary across religious groups. Some, Hindus being somewhat more likely to say they prefer a strong leader, Buddhists being more likely to say they prefer a democratic government. We do see some variation by education, but overall, it's fairly clear that Indian society at this point expresses ambivalence about the efficacy of democracy. And this is true across a variety of religious groups, age groups, as well as education levels.
Right. Another quick sort of question, and this was very interesting because when I was reading the acknowledgement section, you mentioned names of the scholars such as Devesh Kapoor, Ravinder Rajput, Hilal Ahmed, etc. And these are the best minds on Indian politics and religion. Just wanted to understand what was their role. Were they just reviewers? Did they give feedback, or they helped design your questionnaire?
Yeah, they are heavily involved. We recruited a board of 6 eminent scholars, some of whom you mentioned, Devesh Kapoor, Ravinder Kaur, Hilal Ahmed from CSDS, Nina Williams, Shreya Iyer, and I'm missing one person. Jonathan, who am I missing?
Yes, Ajay.
Ajay
Apologies to the person that I'm
Ajay Varghese.
Ajay Varghese, thank you so much. How can I forget Ajay, who's so helpful. So we picked these people after a decent amount of background work by our team. We were looking to find scholars who are some of the best minds, as you were saying, in thinking through issues, these kinds of issues analytically. We were also looking for people who are balanced in the way that they talk about these issues, because we strive for that balance. Right? We do not sensationalize. We do not take normative positions. So we were looking for as much as possible to have an advisory board that reflected those values. So we handpicked, all of these people. And they were heavily involved in all stages. We got to know each other over a course of 3 years so well. We got to know about their families. They got to know about our families, especially when working from home, right? Children interrupting conference calls with with our advisors. So they were heavily involved in the questionnaire development. They reviewed all drafts of the questionnaire. They were very heavily involved in the editorial process. So when we first wrote up our findings, we sent the first draft to our advisors, got feedback from them, incorporated that feedback. But the way that we, our philosophy of working with an advisory board at the Pew Research Center is that it's a give and take. It's an intellectual endeavor where we learn from our advisors and we learn from them heavily. We also give them an opportunity to learn a bit about our ways. So, every time an advisor gave feedback, and for whatever reason, we felt that it wouldn't work for us, right? We have the final call, and all mistakes and any criticism that you have of the report should be directed to the Pew Research Center and not to any of our advisors. But if they gave feedback that we didn't feel could be incorporated, our endeavor always was to engage in a back and forth with the advisor, explain our point of view, explain why phrasing the question in a particular way won't work because of our previous experience in elsewhere or our previous experience in survey research more generally. And I think this back and forth is very valuable for the field because, some of our advisors like Ajay, for example, is a great example. He is an eminent scholar and so highly respected. He doesn't do survey work though. So through this experience, I really hope that he had an opportunity to have a window into the survey world as much as we had through him a window into the work of anthropological ethnographic work, which we highly, highly benefited from. And I will also add that I feel that surveys, we hardly ever generate new knowledge. Right? All we do is we take knowledge previously generated by anthropologists, ethnographers, and we refine that knowledge. We add a number to it to explain how prevalent that particular attitude is. We try to explain the differences among how different demographic groups view the same thing. We talk about whether a particular attitude in India is more prevalent in the north or it's more prevalent in the south. But none of the knowledge that we generate is totally, completely eureka. This is so new. Ajay and Devesh, all of them have talked about these trends previously in our work. So we highly benefited from their experience. And I hope that through the experience of working with us, they benefited in getting the window into the world of public opinion polling.
Interesting. And I would request our listeners to sort of follow the work of these scholars because it's just amazing. My last set of questions, and for that, I want a response from all of you, is this. Is India a melting pot or a salad bowl? And I would start with you, Neha, because you said that it's a thali. Could you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think the thali metaphor, actually, we didn't even think about it when we were working on the analysis and how to write it up. I have an editor on my team who suggested maybe we should say bento box, the Japanese meal where there's a little sushi, in one place, and then there's a little salad in another, and a little rice in another, and it's all compartmentalized. And then I was thinking, bento box won't quite work in an Indian context. So let's go with patchwork quilt. That's the better metaphor for what we're seeing in India. So I don't think, the data suggests that India is neither a melting pot nor a salad bowl. India is a patchwork quilt. It's a country where people feel strongly about living together. They express a high level of commitment to the diversity and pluralism in their country, but at the same time, they express a desire for clear lines and clear boundaries among their communities, be that on the basis of caste or be that on the basis of religion. When we presented that work to an Indian audience. In fact, one of the very first podcasts I did was with Milan Vaishnav at Carnegie. He brought up the metaphor of thali, and I thought, why didn't I think of that? We were so stuck on a bento box. Like, what bento box? We should have thought of thali. Like, how much could we have done with that metaphor? But I think it's quite apt, and that's many Indian commentators have taken our patchwork quilt analogy and sort of expanded it to the Indian context with the concept of the thali model of pluralism.
I have to say that's quite a clickbaity headline, I would say, a thali as a metaphor. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, one thing I like about either the Tolly metaphor or the patchwork quilt metaphor is I think not only does it clearly show the clear lines that people want to draw many times between different communities, whether it be for marriage or for their neighborhoods, but it also does show that there is this broader perception of working together in some level, like all of the patchwork quilt is necessary to keep someone warm, or all of the parts of the Tolly to make the meal. And that, I think, is also then reflected in the findings where people say things like, it is very important to respect all religions to be truly Indian. And they say that I am very free to practice my religion, and other people are very free to practice their religion, that there is this broad sense of religious freedom and a community, even though there are some clear lines that they want to draw.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Mihir, what do you think?
I'm going to not take the bait in terms of trying to define India in any of these ways. All I can say is Neha and Jonathan and their team have done a fabulous job of laying open some of the beliefs that people profess to and opinions that people hold in a fantastic survey that everyone should read. And when Neha and Jonathan are here in person in India, in Bangalore, I'm sure everyone at the Takshashila institution would be happy to host them for a thali or a bento box or a salad or whatever meal they prefer.
We'll take you up on that. Right. Be careful what you promise.
Okay, yes. Great. So on that note, it was a pleasure talking to you, Neha, Jonathan, and Mihir. We should be discussing these issues more often, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Goodbye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
"2020 is a difficult year. A global pandemic, protests, elections, recessions. You get the picture. What we need is a space where we can have nuanced discussions about global affairs and foreign policy. That's where I come in. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and I host the States of Anarchy podcast. Every second Tuesday, I speak to experts in the field of international relations to make a little more sense of the world. So join me on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you're listening to me right now.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.